Good evening. This will be a two-part lecture series. Our basic topic is actually expressing the ineffable, which of course is a contradiction in terms, but such is mysticism. Our topic then is mysticism and how to actually talk about it intelligibly, or to point to it, or to actually describe it without words, or to reach the core of it without words. So these obviously are topics that can be quite confusing, and they have been in the way that they have been discussed. What I will try to do, therefore, is to lead us gently there, but I will begin with a discussion of modernity in philosophical terms and how modernity actually can help us in some ways. In other ways, it actually leads us away from understanding mysticism. So, this will be then a two-part presentation. The first part will be, one might say, in propositional terms. We will be discussing philosophical propositions and trying to see what their limits are. So this will be a lecture on limits as well. And I will follow a fairly straightforward kind of outline. Once I have explained that our main target is to reach oneness or unity from the multiplicity that we see in phenomenal terms when we look around at our world. I can then, in very straightforward terms, talk about ontology, or the structure of reality. Now, one of the problems of modernity was that when someone like Descartes started discussing a new kind of ontology, which still was theistic, but was based on a kind of logic that was different from Aristotle's logic, a kind of physics which was different from Aristotle's physics, one had to start from the very beginning, as it were. And that's what Descartes really does. Descartes wants to talk about first philosophy, but to reach such a first philosophy, he actually needs to start methodologically. In fact, he follows the path of methodological doubt. He doubts everything, and then he concludes that there are actually some things that are indubitable. For example, the fact that I doubt. If I doubt that I doubt, I'm still doubting. So through this kind of consideration and fairly deep meditations, actually, if one reads Descartes, one understands that he was a pretty serious man who actually had a serious purpose, and he wanted to and thought had succeeded in finding the foundations by starting without any foundations. But as was pointed out by Newtonians on the one hand, and by other critics on the other, that Descartes' method actually didn't get one very far. But the challenge that came from the English or British empiricists, Hume was a Scottish philosopher, was probably the more direct one. And this is something that led someone like Kant to say that it was Hume who woke him up from his dogmatic slumber. The problem was the following. If all we have are sense impressions in modern terms that Russell introduced, sense data, then how can we really be sure that we have causes and effects, among other things? All we really have are constant conjunctions event A happens with event B, and that's all. Or temporal succession, that event B comes after event A. So if we have just this kind of observations through our senses, then we cannot really talk about any deeper form of causality or any deeper form of reality even. So everything becomes dependent on senses and sense impressions. The ideas that we have actually come from our sense impressions. People were unhappy with this for many reasons. Kant was unhappy because it didn't allow us to look at anything deeper than just our sense impressions. And very deep questions about not just nature of causality, but also space, time, etc. would not really be answered by following this kind of approach. So he followed actually a two-level approach. At one level, he made science something that could be separated out from deeper religious forms of reality. And he did this by a very clever method of critique. He started by critiquing what we perceive directly, and found a method that he called the transcendental analytics. And through this transcendental analytics, he was able to, or so he thought, establish the structure of causality in the human mind and space, time, and these basic categories, all in human mind. So sometimes this Kantian move is called subjective idealism. On the other hand, Ding an sich, or thing in itself, Kant thought could never be actually reached through pure reason. And therefore that remained an arena for religion. And Kant thought that he had accomplished this Copernican revolution in philosophy by separating out the realm of science from the realm of religious thinking. But many people were unhappy again for many different reasons. People like Hegel were unhappy because this seemed to have made everything dependent on individual subjective ideas in individual minds. So Hegel's move was to establish idealism on a much more objective basis through a kind of dialectical thinking. I have discussed that in paper online, so I will not go further into this since our ultimate objective is to reach out to and into mysticism. So we see that this German idealist approach is something that in many ways could be called a success, but it faced critiques from both more modernized versions of empiricism, modern Humeans, if you will, on the one hand, and on the other hand, Hegelian materialists like Marx on the other hand. And this led to a very interesting situation. A third kind of thinking emerged in the form of ideas of people like Nietzsche and a number of philosophers who started out as phenomenologists, mostly students of Husserl, but then dug further into Nietzsche and found some of Nietzsche's ideas very exciting indeed and pushed them much further. Another thinker that I should mention in this context is Henri Bergson. Bergson was also reacting against Kant, but he was trying to find out, well, is there some way to characterize matter and memory and time in such a way that is not dependent on finiteness, this finite type of division. which led in the past into paradoxes like Zeno's paradox. And we find in modern or postmodern times a neo-Bergsonism, if one can call it that, in thoughts of people like DeLucie, for example. So this is a very, very interesting set of moves. And finally, I should mention what Penelope Maddy, who is basically a philosopher of mathematics, calls the second philosophy. And this is something that is not too far from what we might call a naturalist epistemology and naturalist ontology even. The idea here is that science should be essentially following the kind of methods that have been successful, and philosophy, if it wants to philosophize about science, should also look more closely into the methods of science and use the same methods to philosophize. Earlier, in a different guise, something like this led to the ideas of Vienna Circle and logical positivism. But Maddy wants to actually get away from that kind of thinking, which is essentially a modern type of Humean thinking. The idea here was that, well, essentially you have two kinds of truths in this world. The first kind is analytic truth. We could say, for example, that all bachelors are unmarried men. It's true by definition. Unmarried men are people who are given the name bachelor. So this is an analytic or true by definition kind of truth. Hume actually had called it earlier relations of ideas. A second kind of truth, which we find quite often in science, is something that is arrived at by looking at the world. So if I claim that all men are mortal, that is actually a second kind of truth, because it doesn't follow from the definition of being a man. It actually relies on our repeated observations that we have not found an immortal person, men or women, yet, which does not mean that there could not be one in the future. So this kind of truth is somewhat different from the first kind of truth, the analytic truth. Now, the person who tried to follow this line of thinking the farthest and deepest was an Austrian-German thinker, Rudolf Carnap. And Carnap dug very deeply into the structure of language. Again, we come back to the idea of propositions in a very, very deep way in Carnap. And Carnap tried to actually find a logical way through propositions to answer such questions as to what degree a scientific theory is confirmed, and made quite a bit of progress. One of his disciples, Quine, who taught at Harvard for a long time, however, started moving away from Carnap, in fact, logical positivism, by pointing out some of the fundamental contradictions in this analytic-synthetic distinction. It will take us too far apart and away from our main quest if we go deeply into Quine. But I think I can sum up by saying that what started in 19th century Germany as a move towards symbolic logic and mathematical logic with the scholars like Frege, and continued through Russell, Wittgenstein, I should say early Wittgenstein of Logicus Tractatus Philosophicus. Late Wittgenstein is different. And continuing on through these Vienna Circle logical positivists or logical empiricists, and culminating in Carnap and Quine. But with Quine, we actually get back to a kind of naturalistic epistemology and even naturalistic ontology. In fact, one of Quine's fellow philosophers at Harvard, Hilary Putnam, at one point in his thinking, pushed this ontological realism or scientific realism quite far. But this is where things basically were in the Anglo-Saxon world, and to some extent still are, till French postmodernism actually hit the scene. But before I go there, I should go back to the 19th century again and discuss two strands of criticism of Kant and Hegel, one in the form of Marxist philosophy, the other in the form of Nietzschean philosophy. In Marxist philosophy, or what later was called dialectical materialism, Marx actually went back to the Greek atomists. You may recall that there were two kinds of atomists, at least in ancient Greece. One kind, we can call them mechanical atomists, people like Democritus, where things basically were very mechanical. Everything was predictable, everything had been decided at the beginning of the universe, and matter and motion decided the rest of it. So it was a play of matter and motion. And time was basically motion of matter at different points. Epicurus, however, had a different kind of materialism. Atoms certainly moved most of the times predictably, but there was something that Epicureans call clinomen. This clinomen was deviation from the atom's path. So that meant that things were not perfectly predictable, things were not perfectly certain, and there was some room for flux and change that was unpredictable. Marx very cleverly took over the dialectical method of Hegel, his master, and then tried to give it a materialist basis following Epicurus. Marx's doctoral dissertation actually was mainly on the atomism, the materialism more broadly of Epicurus. Marx had actually quite complex take on religion. Most people quote him as having said religion is the opium of the masses, which he actually did, although not exactly in that form. But a few sentences before that, he actually observed very profoundly and astonishingly, for people who just stick with the opium sentence, he said, religion is the soul of soulless conditions. Soul of soulless conditions. So he actually understood that there was something deep also in religion, something that becomes even necessary, maybe insidiously necessary, in a world of alienation, in a world where there is no soul. Unfortunately, Marx never bothered to follow this up and pursue this. But in terms of Marx's life, his personal life, his appreciation of art and beauty, and his Aristotelianism, eudaimonism, that human flourishing is what is ultimately to be valued, there seems to be a kind of deep secular version of soulfulness in Marx. But rather dogmatically, I think Marx and Marxists and people who call themselves materialists in general dismiss the existence of spirit. But part of the problem, as I have been saying all along, is semantics. Part of the problem is the problem of having to deal with words and having to discuss all these things in propositional terms. The person who actually, in a rather complex and tortured way, tried to get away from this was Nietzsche. Nietzsche was trained as a philologist, so he knew a lot about languages and words, but he was definitely a very rebellious person. He's famous for having said, or infamous for having said, that God is dead. And I will read something to you which will actually put the whole case a little more complicatedly. He definitely looked around and spotted a lot of hypocrisy, especially in Christianity. And one of his earliest books, which was The Genealogy of Morals, and another one, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. In both of those, he discussed how a morality that he called slave morality developed over time, where the individual had to subordinate himself or herself. Actually, Nietzsche was a sexist, like every man in his generation. So I think he probably had someone like himself in mind. So he wanted to assert the individual ego, if you will, in the face of social conventions and following rules. And he thought that Christianity was one of those traditions which was very hidebound and made people follow rules too much. And he tried to find, actually, in classical antiquity, a kind of pre-Christian pagan master morality, a morality that was not bound, certainly not hidebound, in the way that Christianity and Christian morality in Nietzsche's mind was. But Nietzsche's ideas about God and death of God were really were a little more complicated than people give him credit for. Here is a section 125 from Gay Science, which comes a little later. And this is sometimes called the parable of the madman. And this is how it goes. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, "I'm looking for God! I'm looking for God!" As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he excited considerable laughter. "Have you lost him then?" said one. "Did he lose his way like a child?" said another. Or, "Is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated?" Thus they shouted and laughed. The madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. "Where has God gone?" he cried. "I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. We are his murderers. But now, how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not perpetually falling backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? So this is something that presents us both in social and in ontological terms something deeper, I claim. In social terms, it's the marketplace that seems to have killed God. And in ontological terms, it seems that it is our indifference, our callousness, our negligence to nourish the spirit that has killed God. Nietzsche clearly sees the death of God as a problem. It's not something to be overjoyed about. And you can look at this sentence, for example. The madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. And Nietzsche uses a very evocative language by talking about the death of God in terms of our worlds losing its center of gravity and of energy, the sun. So it is something that, that was not a trivial matter with Nietzsche. Unfortunately, the Nietzscheans, especially the postmoderns, don't seem to pay too much attention to these things. They think that Nietzsche was all about play and kind of a joyous affirmation, saying to life, which is certainly true. But there is something that is both deeper and more disturbing in terms of the death of God in Nietzsche. Now, these problems of causation are not really unknown in non-Western explorations, and towards the end of my talk, I will talk about Nagarjuna and Ibn Arabi and finish with some explorations in a more body-centric type of spirituality that may be appropriate for our time as a kind of lead-in to the next lecture. But right now, let me confine myself to this Western phenomenological tradition and phenomenological Nietzscheanism, we might call this. And this became very, very clear after the destruction of the First World War, when Europe basically lost its moorings, its intellectual and moral moorings in terms of humanism. And lots of different movements, especially in art, but also in philosophy, started to spring up. There were movements like Dadaism, Surrealism, etc. in art. In philosophy, existentialism was perhaps the most important development. And it developed in its atheistic form, directly inspired by Nietzsche, but going through Husserl and Heidegger, especially Heidegger. And Sartre studied Heidegger quite deeply, and Sartrean existentialism owes a lot to Heidegger. And much of postmodern thought that developed in the wake of the failures of the revolutions of 1960s, especially the French student revolt of May 1968, many of those followed Nietzsche as well as a kind of critique of Sartrean type of existentialism. Now, to discuss those things in detail, and they do deserve discussion in detail, would take us too far away from what we really want to discuss. So let me just draw a line through Humean, Bergsonian, Nietzschean thought of DeLucie, and then discuss Badiou a little bit, and before going on to a very important thinker, Emmanuel Levinas. So first, DeLucie. DeLucie studied a number of philosophers very, very deeply early on. One of them, of course, was Nietzsche. Another one was Spinoza, and a third one yet was Bergson. And there was something that resonated with DeLucie. The basic problem that DeLucie was trying to address was the becoming of man. How to characterize human existence, that it is not something fixed, it is something that evolves, it is something that can be creative, although it is often alienated. So you can also call DeLucie a kind of post-Marxist in that sense, although he never really engaged very much with Marxist thought in the sense of critique of political economy, a deep critique of idealism, etc. So DeLucie, in Difference and Repetition, developed seriously a kind of materialist ontology based on differences that celebrates differences. And earlier he had written Logic of Sense, where he essentially updated Hume and gave a kind of materialist sense to Hume. But DeLucie's Difference and Repetition is indeed a very, very deep book, because it's also a critique of what he calls images of thought, where we essentially dogmatically adhere to a set of propositions without considering the basis of our adherence, and without realizing that the world really is always in the process of change and flux, and there is no distinct identity, so to speak. All identity at best is a relative type of identity. So DeLucie actually goes pretty far within this framework, and yet at the end DeLucie ends up producing a lot of very interesting concepts, but without being able to capture that lived experience that phenomenologists have always talked about. In one of my papers online on Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, and Gadamer, I have discussed this importance of this capturing of lived experience. And mysticism is nothing if not a lived experience. Bergson actually got pretty close to capturing this, I must say. And DeLucie tries to update Bergson, but I think being caught up in this propositional world, it's very difficult, even with the best intentions in the world and the least dogmatic mind in the world, to capture this lived experience in all its color and reverberations. And that's what mysticism really does. So we see that DeLucie's thought also runs into a dead end in this sense. What about Badiou? Badiou he's still alive, a very interesting philosopher. He's also a novelist and political activist. He wrote a book basing his whole ontology on the mathematics of set theory. And it is very interesting. It's very laborious reading, and for people who are not trained in mathematics, it's probably hopeless even to try. But it is a very interesting way of looking at ontology. But from there, he develops ideas of what he calls truth conditions. That we have truth conditions of politics, for example. We have truth conditions of science. But most importantly, we have truth conditions of love. And here, Badiou also comes very, very close to capturing that ecstatic lived experience, as it were. And sometimes he even succeeds, I'd say. But again, he realizes, I think, more than anyone else, that propositional forms of thinking are really not adequate. And that's probably why he tries his hand at other kinds of expressiveness, like writing novels or getting involved in direct political activities. So here we have very, very interesting postmodern thinkers, I think. But the one who is most interesting to me from considerations that I have been discussing is Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas was also deeply interested in phenomenology and Heidegger, but almost immediately when he started writing about these things in the 1930s, he took a much more critical stance to Heidegger. He actually thought of a continuous presence of being rather than the Heideggerian move of unveiling being and getting stuck with language, which are insightful, definitely, but at the same time one might even say evasive. And then Levinas, being a Jew, had to spend time in concentration camp in Germany, and much of his family, which was Lithuanian, was exterminated. So his experiences also were very different. In a way, he probably could feel the whole burden of history of the 20th century, as James Joyce put it in such a revealing way, that history is a nightmare from which we are trying to awake. This certainly is the experience of people living through wars in the Middle East today, for example. So Levinas really pushed it very far, and in 1961 he wrote an amazing book which came out of his doctoral dissertation, Totality and Infinity. And in this he introduced a concept of face-to-face. And this really is something that was in his philosophy before, but he made it the center and main focus of his philosophy, that what human beings are actually are exposures to otherness. Otherness that would also impose infinite responsibility on every human being, and this infinite responsibility is impossible to live up to, and yet we must face up to this. Therefore, face-to-face is not very kind of nice, genteel way of being. It's a very hardcore of reality where you have to face up to your impossible moral responsibilities and yet try. So in some ways it is similar to the myth of Sisyphus, that he rolls the stone up and then as soon as it is up there, it comes rolling down again, and you have to keep doing the same thing again. And then Levinas did something even more daring, and this was his 1974 book that went beyond the early book of Totality and Infinity. And in Totality and Infinity, by the way, he also put a lot of emphasis on family as opposed to the state. And this is something that has an echo, among others, in subaltern history. Today we are very suspicious of state, not just in a liberal way, but in a deep phenomenological way, and in a way that can be called historical hermeneutic suspicion. And this book, which can be translated into the English title "Otherwise Than Being," it's really a very important book, I think, and takes propositional form of discussion as far as it can be taken, I think. One philosopher has characterized the innovations in Otherwise Than Being in following terms. The three most remarkable innovations of Otherwise Than Being include: 1, the proposed phenomenological reduction to the birth of meaning in a self, carrying what is not itself, that is, the other, effectively. This is a radicalization of Husserl's idealism, in which meaning arises thanks to the inner dialogue, whose language is more rarefied than that composed of everyday signs. Second, the exploration of sensibility as the locus at which inside and outside merge. If sensibility already played an important role in Totality and Infinity, sensibility will now be traced back to the density of the flesh itself. And the flesh serves Levinas as his pre-consciousness, whose ontological meaning counts above all else. The exploration of the self, that is the third item, the exploration of the self minus the intentional ego through an affective complex unfolds in a language that is best communicated through enactment. It can be likened to prophetic witness. It is as though Levinas was describing the affective investiture of a subject called to witness. This is also the sense of subject carrying more than it can express and breathing under the constraints of that investiture. This is a very deep book. Again, I can do no more than just give you a flavor of it in this short lecture. But this, and if I had time, I'd have talked about Paul Ricoeur and his later hermeneutics of interpretations. But I think it's best to go on to Ibn Arabi at this point, who many centuries before these thinkers had already decided that there had to be a way to express our longing for understanding the depth of reality and unity in diversity through language until it took us to the edge of understanding, and then we can pursue other mystical practices. I should mention quickly also that Nagarjuna, who was a Buddhist philosopher and lived several centuries even before Ibn Arabi, already had analyzed, of course this was not known to Ibn Arabi, among other things through an analysis of causation, and let me just discuss briefly what this was. Nagarjuna distinguishes 4 ways in which things could be causally brought about. They could be produced, first of all, from themselves, secondly, from other things, thirdly, from both themselves and from other things, and fourthly, from neither. So these four ways of talking, Chatushkoti as the Sanskrit expression goes, led Nagarjuna to show that ultimately reality is emptiness or shunyata. But this shunyata is also fullness, and here we are already facing paradoxes of language. And ultimately it is a deep mystical experience that gets us beyond all these paradoxes. And those of you who are involved in or interested in Zen Buddhism or Taoism will notice the similarities as well. Taoism, and especially Tao Te Ching by Lao Tse, is a very beautiful poetic expression of what I just said. So let me mention just this about Ibn Arabi and just one concept. In the next lecture I will go into more depth and detail as well as actual experiential exploration of non-propositional ways of doing things through art, literature and music. But Ibn Arabi introduces an idea. In Arabic it's khayal, which can be translated as imagination, but it is much more than imagination. It is a whole complex of creative drives in human beings, and it exists primarily non-propositionally and primarily starts at the pre-verbal stage, but it can be expressed linguistically in the form of ideas, can be explored through many different media. And this was one of the most important ideas that Ibn Arabi actually discusses. The other idea, and maybe it's best to finish this part with this before I discuss one opening that I am trying to pursue myself personally. Ibn Arabi's work is very prolific and very deep, so he is a very difficult person to read, both in terms of quality and in terms of quantity. But this idea of haq, which can be translated variously as truth or as justice, as right even, is very important. And his school, one of his main interpreters, Kunawi, differentiates Ibn Arabi's position both from that of falsafa, which is roughly philosophical thinking, and scholastic theology in Islam that was called Kalam, and calls it Mashrab al-Taqiq. The school of realization is the way William Chittick translates it, and that's probably a good translation. So this idea of tahqiq is the cornerstone of Ibn Arabi's vast corpus. So this has something to do with both being true, real, but also being right, worthy, appropriate, etc., etc. So in the next lecture, we will explore this more deeply and more extensively. I want to finish with something that I have been calling new Bodhi. Bodhi is what, of course, Buddha comes from. So Bodhi historically has been basically explored idealistically, that is, as an idea. But I think it is very important in light of, one might say failed, but worthy failed endeavors of phenomenologists to actually have embodied thinking, as it were. I think we can call Bodhi the kind of enlightenment that involves our bodies, our minds, our whole selves, beyond dualism. So it involves both intuition and intellect. It is, in a way, best expressed in words, not propositionally, but through images, metaphors, etc., in poetry. For example, the Spanish poet Hernández, and I translated this for you, says, "My life is a wound with a happy childhood. Woe for him who is not wounded, who never feels wounded by life, never rests in life, wounded, lighthearted, and rejoicing." And a more modern, or perhaps even postmodern French poet, a woman named Anne-Marie Albiach, wrote something called Enigma. And she says, "The rain had that color, the body that is seized by the urge to know the exposures." And finally, Rilke, who is a very deep poet indeed, tells us, "Whoever goes now anywhere in the world, without ground, goes anywhere in the world, goes to me. Whoever dies now anywhere in the world, without ground, dies in the world, looks at me." And Sufi, the mystics, and that was my ultimate target. I will just quote a few things by a few of these mystics. One of them says, "By yourself you can do nothing. Seek a friend. If you could taste the slightest bit of your insipidity, you would recoil from it." This is the great Persian poet Nizami. We can see that he's getting us pretty close to where I think Levinas really wants us to go. Rumi, Maulana Rumi, the great mystic poet, says, "If you are a love's lover, take a sharp dagger and cut the throat of bashfulness. How all the world trembles because of love, which transcends all below and on highs. Soul of soul, do you speak, for every atom has grown tongues out of love for your face." And Rumi, to me, really expresses this way of reaching the heart, the soul, and he truly pinpoints the need, necessity, and role of love in mysticism. And so let me finish with another one of his beautiful lines. "O love, O pure deep love, be here, be now, be on. Worlds dissolve into your stainless, endless radiance. Frail living leaves burn with your brighter than coal stairs. Make me your servant, your breath, your core." Thank you.